Let's talk about it. Come on and shout it. I talk, you talk, we talk. Women talk life. It ain't no surprise. Baby, you could see if you would open up your eyes. You won't understand if you can't open up your mind. So let's stop wasting time when women talk life.
And welcome to another episode of Women Talk Live Overnights. I'm your girl, April J.
I'm your girl, SassyScribe.
And this is KO Boogie.
And our special guest today, and I'm so excited to have her on with us, is Charmel McMillan. And she is author, manager, public relations, like all wrapped up into one. All wrapped up
Yes.
into one. And we want to talk a little bit about that before we kind of get into your story, because I wanted to kind of give folks, because you have a background in entertainment. So, kind of give everybody a little sense of your resume.
Well, it's been almost 30 years of me being in business, having an entertainment and sports management company. And I started out with comedians back in the 90s. And I think I worked with over 400, that might be a mild estimate, comedians over the years. Everything from negotiating deals to making sure the deal was right and everything in between.
Right.
And after that, I guess I got my stage plays and became director of PR and marketing for different stage plays nationally. And I got my authors that I work with, Carl Weber. So we've been working together since 2002. I got Omar Tyree the same year and started doing releases for them. And so the relationship with Carl has continued over the years. And so I actually did the movie release for his first movie, Man in 3D, with Christian Keys, Lamont Rucker, and whole, all-star cast. And so we had a good time with that. And so actually, this is probably a caveat, but this week coming up, I have Ben Stevens, who's the star of Family Business, his new series. And so
Wow.
he's going to be on my new podcast called And Then Suddenly. So that's a small plug. But going back to my career, everything just kind of evolved. You know what I mean? If I sit here and talk about my resume, my career, I tell you, is crazy. So if I sit here and talk about that, it's going to be a long show. So everything just kind of
Toot that
evolved,
horn, baby. Toot that horn.
Yes,
Toot that
absolutely.
but
horn.
okay, I'll say this. Just One Thing was my first book. I never expected to be an author. I work with so many authors from Zane to Carl to Omar Tyree, and I never expected to be an author myself. And so it ended up selling out 5 times nationally, Just One Thing. Mike Epps wrote the foreword for it. My longtime friend of 30 years wrote the foreword for it. And it talks about how I started off as a professional engineer and my degrees are in engineering. So I have an undergrad in industrial engineering, double minor in mathematics and business, dual master's in engineering and business
Wow.
management, concentration in contract law from George Washington. So I had no aspirations of entertainment or
Okay,
sports
you should
management
have
or
slowed that
anything
down.
like that. And so Just One Thing is about how God had bigger plans and different plans than my own.
Indeed, he
But I
does.
remember I was designing collapsible water tanks and fuel tanks and tactical petroleum terminals. I was an engineer, so right out of college. And I stood outside one day beside the Humvees and all the tanks and stuff that I had designed and prayed and said, God, any way you bless me, I'm cool. I just don't want to do this anymore. And then my life started to change suddenly. And that was almost 30 years ago. And so within a few months, I was meeting with Colin Powell and Bob Johnson at the height of BT and D.L. Hughley. Talked to me and we were introduced, and then we had a long conversation where he was like, you need to be in this industry, you're going to take it by storm. And then Paul Mooney befriended me, and so my book kind of talks about the cornerstones of my career and how that happened and how it evolved into these lifelong relationships, and how I was the first person to put Paul Mooney on nationally on radio syndicated. And people were afraid of Mooney because his language
I loved
and
him.
just
How
his
I
I
know.
loved
personality.
One of
him.
my
But
favorites.
he did it for me. And so the first show I put him on was Russ Parr, and they were in 62 markets at the time.
Yep.
And so God just kept opening doors. And I believe that, like I say in Just One Thing, my first book, that destiny is when the unexpected meets the inevitable. And one of the things I always say is I have never introduced myself to anyone in this industry. And so I've either been introduced or they've come and introduced themselves. I'm an introvert, so I'm not going to say hi to you. I stay in the same place no matter where I am. um, when I'm at venues or concerts or whatever, the show usually comes over to me and people usually start talking to me. So that's kind of been the nature of my career, And so then I got into sports management. I managed the face of Under Armour for several years. We had ESPN and NFL deals, and I didn't expect sports management either. Then was that my second? I think my second clients were the Mayweather family. And so I didn't know anything about boxing, but like I said, destiny is when the unexpected meets the inevitable. So I had a long-term business associate who called me one day and said, Floyd Sr.'s gonna call you in 5 minutes. I was like, who's Floyd Sr.? So he said Mayweather. I was like, about what? And so then he said, just be yourself. I said, okay. So I was myself. We talked for over an hour. And
Wow.
so it was like the best conversation. And after I got off the phone, my business associate called me. He said, you got a new client. And I said, what am I supposed to be doing for him? He said, he'll tell you. And so
Wow.
then he said, about a month later, he said, Roger's going to call you tomorrow. And I said, okay. So then I
Oh,
met Roger and we sat around talking like we'd known each other forever. He said, you're going to have all the Mayweathers by the time I'm done. And so by
Wow.
the end of the year, Floyd Jr. had called me. And then a couple years later, after I've been working with Senior and on some different projects and stuff like that, um, I met Jeff, the other brother, who's an international boxing trainer. And so I ended up working with the whole family and representing them at the World Boxing Coalition. And,
wow.
it was a nice ride. So I worked with them for probably like 7 years. We had like the most uncanny relationship, and it was nobody but God, who had, established all the stuff in my career, and so things just kept kind of mushrooming after that. And so music artists, I was a record label exec for a long time. I think that's when I met, pardon me, but your ex-husband. I
No,
met
that's
him.
fine.
That's
That's
how we
fine.
met.
We don't
Yeah, of
speak of him.
course.
No, I'm
Yeah,
just
of
joking.
course. No, no, no,
No,
it's
but
fine.
I'm
That's
telling
how
my
we
story.
met. That's how we
I
met.
know,
So
How
I know,
yeah,
I know. I'm
how
just joking.
serendipitous it was. He was working with Def Jam, Island Black, or doing
hmm
something with them, and we
right.
had a record label called 410 Music in
hmm
Baltimore, which was born from the management company of Drew
Yep.
Hill. So Kevin
Right.
Peck was my business partner. So that's how I became a record label exec and vice president of marketing and handling stuff for the groups. And um, that's kind of how the music. And so a lot of my babies now are multi-platinum producers, and so they were like 17 years old back then, and so shout out to Wild Jones, who I just talked to last week, and he and his partner in crime. I mean, like, they are the power couple of power couples.
Wow.
They have Beauty in Black, and that was called Tyler Perry's new thing. They wrote the
Yes,
soundtrack for that. I think
indeed.
Love
they're
that.
Yes,
they're in
Love
consideration
indeed.
for
that.
a Grammy.
Love it.
Yeah, I mean, and so he's been the music director for Post Malone and Bryson Tiller, music director for Usher on the most recent tour, and my babies are doing it. And so when I talk to
Okay.
them, they're still like the same 17-year-olds. He said, remember when you cooked for us and you would come in the middle of the night and check on us at the different labels, and you bought like macaroni and cheese and all kinds of food because we hadn't eaten. We were like, we ain't had no money. They still talk about that. And
Uh,
so I just did what I felt was right,
right.
and I took care of artists over the years.
Mm,
Like I was saying to one of my guests the other night on my show, Griff from Get Up with Erica in the mornings, and he
mm,
says I helped establish his career, and so I said I just tried to do the right thing. I didn't understand some of the nuances of the entertainment industry. I didn't understand. Let me holler at you after shows, and I was like, they told you what now? And so I would just step in and make sure everybody got paid or make sure things were done right.
mhm,
And I didn't think if people are relying on whatever you promised them and they're using their God-given talent to put on a show or whatever, you treat them poorly or treat them badly, you
mhm.
know? And so, longer story short, that's kind of how my career evolved into all the different facets of, the entertainment industry. I didn't touch on everything, but everything kept
Yeah.
evolving, naturally. It's a natural progression of things as God saw fit, and then I became an author.
Okay. Yeah.
So,
All right. So we're gonna pivot just a little bit, because I do want you to be able to share your story because, like I said, you had a very powerful story, and it was so crazy because I think it was your birthday, and I said, I was like, oh, it's her birthday. I said, happy birthday, and then that's when we connect back up. And
Yeah.
so not well recently, you went through a battle that
Yeah.
you could have really lost your life. So I want you
I
to
did lose my life. I
yeah,
cannot.
well, yeah, exactly. Exactly. Yeah, yeah, yeah. But I want you to kind of get into a little bit of that. Just kind of starting off like what happened, how you kind of, went through it, and just share your story. Share your story.
Okay, so this is what happened. I was producing a series called Just One Thing after my book, right? And I had over 184 episodes on IG alone, to over 200 guests. I even did the Whisper's last interview while they were on tour together before the other twin got sick, before Sky got sick.
Mhm.
And so I was rolling, and then all of a sudden I wasn't rolling. And so I just started having back pain suddenly. And so I had to cancel whatever guest I had scheduled. And I called my female best friend and I said, you got to come see about me. I said, because I've been taking myself to doctors for the last 2 days and they keep telling me it's nothing. Just take some muscle relaxers. And I was like, it's not what they're saying. And nobody will help me. Nobody's taking me seriously. And, as a caveat, that's a problem, I think, in society that they don't take women seriously, women of color seriously when it comes to our health, when it comes to our health concerns. And a lot of times we don't look like what we've been through. You know
Right,
what I
Right.
mean? And
right.
Right.
so I
Amen.
never looked sickly. You know what I mean? So they weren't taking me seriously. I probably looked the
They
same as
don't
I look
believe
right
us.
this second, but
Yeah.
I was having excruciating back pain. And so they kept, blowing me off. So anyway, she took me to a couple different places, a couple different medical hospitals and stuff like that, and nobody was really taking me seriously. The final day, this lasted for about 6, 7 days, total. And so the final day, I was laying in pain all night long in my bed, and I heard her get up and walking around my house, and so I yelled out, "I need to go to the emergency room." And so she took me to. Well, when I stood up, tried to stand up, kind of roll out of bed, because I was in so much pain. I couldn't feel my feet and my lower legs. And so somehow she got me to the hospital in like 5, 10 minutes and said, "You need me to have a wheelchair." I said, "No, I can walk. I just can't feel my feet hitting the ground." And so I got in there and I just felt like I couldn't stand anymore. So I stopped some man walking by and I said, "Sir," I said, "I can't stand anymore." I said, "My back is searing and I can't feel my feet and my lower legs." And so he went and got a wheelchair. I don't know who this was. It was a Saturday morning, took me out of the registration line, took me directly into triage. That was nobody but God. I don't even
Mm,
know how I finished registering or whether my best friend registered for me. He just took me directly into the triage nurse. There was no waiting. She hadn't even parked the car yet. That's how fast they were moving. And
wow.
so that was just God. And so I got in there, the triage nurse started taking out my earrings. I said, "What are you doing?" "Prepping you for the emergency MRI." I mean, so everything felt like a blur and a dream, And so while she's doing that, my best friend walks in and um she I said, "I don't feel well." I said, "I need to lay down. Help me lay down." And so when she helped me lay down, that's when I went paralyzed from the chest down. So I went paralyzed in the emergency room less than 5 or 6 minutes after walking into the hospital. And so they transferred me to a gurney, took me to the emergency MRI, did it for an hour and a half, and I was in so much pain. I just remember tears running down my face because of the pain of it all. And so after an hour and a half, they said, "Miss Well, we need to do it again." And I said, "It's going to take as long?" They said, "No, we just need to make sure we saw what we thought we saw." And so I didn't even care what they saw or thought they saw. I was so glad somebody was listening to me
Listen to
finally
you.
and taking me seriously. I was like, I pray they can help me. I don't know what they see, but I hope they can help me. So 30 minutes later, they said, "We're taking you to emergency surgery." This all happened it was like 10 minutes to getting to the MRI room. They started immediately. I went paralyzed the first 5 minutes. That's how fast they're moving. So less than 2.5 hours after walking into the hospital, they're now transferring me from the MRI bed onto the operating table, and the anesthesiologist starts counting down. That's how
Wow.
fast they were moving. And
Wow.
so I still didn't know what was going on. So I had no idea that it was a deadly abscess on my spine. MRSA had set in, it had gone septic, and
Mm,
it was huge on my spine. And so They operate, I come through that. The next day, I'm in recovery. And a therapist walks in and says, "We're going to get you out walking." I said, "I guess I can walk again." So I'd never been sick before. I had no pre existing conditions, no health issues. I hadn't been to the hospital since birth. And I mean, I go to all my doctor's appointments, everything. So I didn't even get sick during the pandemic. Like, I didn't have health issues at all. And so this just came out of nowhere. And so she says, "We're going to get you out walking." I get out walking. I tell her I'm a best-selling author. We're laughing and making small talk or whatever. Told I was a best-selling author. Told the tech to record it because I said I'm about to write another bestseller. And so a few minutes later, I collapsed from cardiac arrest and I flatlined for 10.5 minutes. And so 4 minutes is brain damage. And so 10.5 minutes, they told my mom, who had just gotten to the hospital right before the therapist got there. I told her to wait in the hallway because it was so small in that ICU room. And so they told her eventually, "We can't bring your daughter back around. She's not going to make it." And so she called to tell my father, who was at my house. He didn't even come. Evidently, they had come the night before when I was like, had come out of surgery. And so they had driven straight from North Carolina, so I didn't even know all this, So he didn't come for her because I was stable. And he was like, "Maybe she's resting. I'll let you go and I'll go later today." But that's what happened. And so she called and told him, they said she took a turn for the worse and she's not going to make it. And they can't get her breathing again. And so then she called my brother, who's a minister, and he's in North Carolina too. And she said, he just started praying with me. And she said, "I never heard it before, but he started speaking in tongues." And she said, something in the atmosphere shifted. And she said, all of a sudden, someone tapped me and said, "Miss McMillan, we got her." And they had me breathing again. But from that point on, I was in a 10-day coma. And so after while I was in the 10-day coma, later that same first day, after flatlining for 10.5 minutes, I flatlined for 6.5 minutes later that day. And that's when they discovered both my lungs had filled to capacity with blood clots. Both my arms and legs had blood clots. I had massive double pulmonary embolism, massive DVT throughout my body. One blood clot will kill you. I had too many blood clots in my body and in my lungs to count. And so they couldn't figure out how to get me breathing again because there were too many blood clots to get oxygen back into the lungs. And so they did some risky procedure that was explained to me later would kill you, but I was already dead. And so they tried to blast the blood clots just enough to force some type of oxygen into the lungs. And so somehow it worked and they put me on a breathing machine. And so day 2 of the 10-day coma, I had an acute stroke and an aneurysm at the same time. And acute stroke is either deadly or brain damage. And, well, people know what an aneurysm is. And the third day, I started bleeding on my spine. And so spinal hemorrhage, which is also deadly. And they went in to do a second emergency surgery in less than 3 days. And so they opened up my back again to try to stop the spinal hemorrhage. And the prognosis is crazy. It's beyond grim. They don't know if I'm, one, going to wake up out the coma. 2, I'll probably be paralyzed the rest of my life, because I've had double spine surgery on my thoracic spine, and I've had an acute stroke and an aneurysm, all of which are debilitating to your brain. 17 minutes of lost oxygen in one day. And they just didn't hold out much hope for anything working out. And then if I did come through, I'd probably be brain damaged and, like I said, never walk again. And so, 7 days later, even though I had a 12-inch incision down my spine and 27 staples holding my back together with 3 drain tubes, and somebody called my name, and I was totally paralyzed while I was, in this coma again. And so someone called my name, I believe it was a nurse, and said, "Miss McMillan." And I opened my eyes and looked at the person who called me and said, "Yes." And so she just froze. And so then I looked at everybody around the room. It was all these doctors and nurses. And they were just staring with their mouths open. I'm looking like, what's wrong with y'all? And so then someone said, "Do you know where you are?" And I said, "I assume the hospital. I'm in a hospital bed." And they said, "Do you know why you're here?" And I said, "Did emergency surgery on my spine." They said, "Oh, far more than that happened." And then someone said, "Do you know what day it is?" And I said, "No." They said it's March 14th. I said, ooh, a lot of days passed. Because I knew I came in March 4th.
Mhm.
Ooh.
And I said, my mom's birthday's in 3 days. They said, when's your birthday? I said, June 14th. Oh, she's back. That's all they said. I had no idea what was going on, why people were just standing around the room staring at me. I felt fine considering I'd never been sick before, never had emergency surgery or major surgery. And so I'm just laying in the bed. And so I think it was 2 days later, a doctor came, a specialist came, and he said, we have to do an important test on your heart because we got to find this infection. I didn't know they were talking about MRSA and acceptance is set in. So they said, you got to sign a waiver because you could die during this test.
Mm.
And so
What?
yeah. And so it was major, the test. And so they actually had to do another procedure where they put me under general anesthesia again. Um, and so he handed me the pen. He put the pen in my hand, but I realized I couldn't write. And I said, there's something wrong with my hand. And he was like, it's okay. No, it's not okay. So the next day, so I
Back.
signed the waiver. They said it would take 2 days to get the results back. So meanwhile, all these specialists are coming to my room. And so I find out they had brought in 7 specialists from 3 different hospitals who had never seen
Wow.
anything like this before, ever. It was the most catastrophic thing they've ever seen, really, in medical history, they're telling me. And so I don't know why they're coming to introduce themselves, but I found all that out later. And so anyway, they would come and say, I'm so and so from Georgetown, or I'm so and so from this hospital. I'm head of cardiology, I'm head of hematology, I'm head of this and that. And so then they would just stare at me. And it was just like so weird and, eerie. I'm like, what are you looking at? And they're like, a miracle.
A miracle.
Mm.
So I said, oh, I said, well, thank you for whatever you did. And I smiled. And so then I would say the same thing to every single doctor. And so one lady came in, and so she said I had to come see it for myself. She was a specialist from Georgetown. So I had to come see it for myself. They said that you were alert and talking like nothing happened. And I had to come see it for myself.
Wow.
And so I said, I feel pretty good, I guess. I said, I've just been laying here, though I haven't, they moved my bed up. I said, but I haven't sat up or done anything. I felt fine. I didn't know I was totally paralyzed.
Mm.
And so I just thought, in my naivete, I knew I couldn't feel my legs. I knew I couldn't feel anything really, but I didn't think it was because I was paralyzed. And in my mind, I was like, well, they did spine surgery. That must be like when my mom talked about having kids and having an epidural. It must be something like that. They must put a shot somewhere, so I didn't think, I thought my feeling would come back eventually, but I didn't know I was paralyzed. And
Mm.
so that's kind of what happened. So when they came back with the test results, the specialist said, we have your results. And I said, what did you find? And they said, there's no infection in your body. And so I said, what does that mean? That means you're the luckiest woman in the world.
Mm.
So as quickly as MRSA and sepsis had set in, God moved it.
Mm.
Wow.
And so um, then I remember just realizing that I was paralyzed. And I won't go through the whole story because it's extensive, but I do talk about my entire journey in my new book, And Then Suddenly. um, but one of the things was, I guess, last part I'll say is probably seeing my back for the first time, and not really having any scars on my body. And, I don't even get bumps on my face. So I was like, this was a new thing to me. And so then came to change my bandages one day. And I asked the nurse to take a picture of my back because I wanted to know what the aftermath of spine surgery looked like. I don't think I even knew. I still didn't know everything I had been through. I didn't know why everybody was in a hysteria. I was like, maybe I know I was in the ICU for 25 days. I was in the hospital a total of 49 days,
Mm.
and so by this time I knew I couldn't walk, but I never used the word paralyzed in the hospital. I just said, I can't walk yet.
Mhm.
And so I didn't know what the prognosis was.
Mhm.
But there was one lead surgeon who says, I don't care, you're going to walk again. So I believed his faith. And God told me it was just temporary while I was laying there. I couldn't even will my legs to move. They would just fall off the bed. And I'd have to, push the button or ask somebody to come get my leg and hold on until somebody came. So I didn't fall off the
Mhm.
bed. So I had no muscle control whatsoever, no feeling. But I know when I told the nurse to take a picture of my back, um, I waited till she left because I didn't know what that aftermath was going to look like. And so picked up my phone, I looked at my phone, and I saw this thing going down my back. It was long, and there were staples and holes for the with drain tubes. The drain tubes were connected, and I remember laying there counting the staples. There were 27 of them, and I started to cry for the first time in the hospital. This was probably after a week or two of being awake, and I started to cry. And then I stopped crying because God told me, do you remember the story of the Israelites crossing the Jordan River, and when they were instructed to gather, the 12 tribes were instructed to gather a stone, and that stone serves a reminder of the promise God made to deliver them and to never leave them.
Mm.
And so I realized in that moment that the scar down my back was my stone. Because looking at me, you can't tell I've been through anything.
Mm-mm.
But
Mm-mm.
when they asked me, what's that going down your back? It's God's promise that He would never leave me. It's God's promise that He would deliver me from everything that I went through. 7 deadly emergencies at the same time. It's the covenant that God gave me in the hospital. It's just temporary. So I walked
Amen.
out of that hospital 7 weeks later, 7 days later. I'm sorry, 7 weeks later. I walked out of that hospital with a walker from total paralysis. A month later, I was walking with a cane. A month after that, I was scaling the walls in my house. I don't want to use a cane anymore. And so, if no one sees my back, they don't know what I went through.
Mhm.
But the scar is my stone. The scar is proof of what God brought me through. And 49 days of laying on my back in a hospital. And so, and then suddenly, that's the story.
Wow.
Wow, yo,
Wow. Jeez.
yo,
Oh,
that's a
I'm
movie.
it-
speechless. I'm speechless.
yeah. Yeah.
You've been
It,
through a lot,
it's
and that's
yeah.
all God.
And your
Yeah.
smile and the light in your eyes is, yeah, there's no way you would know.
Mm-mm.
No way you
No,
would know. That is
Mhm.
amazing.
Not at all. That's why I said it's definitely an inspiring story.
absolutely.
Because for you to have
Absolutely.
come through for what you come through, you were a
Yeah.
testimony for somebody else. That was a
Yeah.
testimony. All, yeah,
Oh,
yeah,
phew.
right.
Yeah,
Yeah, me tearing up over
It's,
here, like, oh
Yeah.
my
that's like a
God.
sermon.
And I'm
You know
sassy,
what
I'm
I'm
tough. No,
I mean, I feel blessed, and some of the chapters that, I put in the book, are a testament. People actually requested what they wanted in this book. And I never saw myself as an author. I never wanted to be an author. I've worked with authors, like I said. I have a publishing entity long before I became an author. I released titles for other authors, but I never saw myself as being an author. But I think it was maybe like 2 months before anything happened. Like I said, everything happened suddenly, literally. But 2 months before, one of my artists called me and he said, you're about to write another bestseller. And I said, well, God's got to do another miracle, baby. And so then I just kind of
Mm,
brushed him off. And he said, no, you told me that God is the God of suddenly. He said, and I'm fresh out the gate in this industry. I only been, really doing stuff professionally for a few years. He said, and I've already won a Grammy. He won a Grammy on the Kendrick Lamar project. And he said, you kept telling me that God doesn't take a long time to do anything. He said, your next book is called And Then Suddenly. I said, okay, love. And I hung up on him. So it was probably like maybe I think it was like the middle of February because March 4th is when I went into the hospital, and I was laying in bed and talking to God, and I said, when you wrote just one thing through me, I surrendered, and I said, anyway you bless me, I'm cool. I said, so I guess if another book is supposed to come, any way you decide to use me, I'm cool. And I woke up from a coma 3 weeks later.
Wow.
And so that's how my surrender happened this time. I talked about a month ago at a women's conference. It was at a hotel, a banquet full of women, and I said, the context of what I'm speaking on is to whom much is given, much is required. And so this time my life was required, but still I trust you. I trust you when the water was up to here, my career and everything. But now I trust you that my life has been required and I'm recovering from the unthinkable. God is still God. And so it's a blessing when there's a chapter in my book called The Gift of Testimony. It's a blessing when God makes you an authority on something. The only reason I've gone through all of the complications I've gone through and all the pain and all the aches and it's been my miracle has been a journey. It wasn't quick,
No.
but I went through it because somebody need to know from someone who can speak with authority on what it's like to be totally paralyzed, on what it's like to feel nerves regenerating in real time. Someone needs to know not to give up because it is extremely painful when your nerves are regenerating from total paralysis, from double spine surgery and major, along your thoracic spine that controls everything. It's excruciating at times. But somebody needs to know you got to push through your pain because your pain is not in vain. That's part of the process. It hurts to recover. If you just push through that pain in a couple of weeks, it won't be hurting there anymore. But if you don't know that, you end up in a nursing home because it's too painful to keep pushing. So somebody needs to tell people who have gone through traumatic brain injury, traumatic brain surgeries, spinal surgeries that push through that pain because it won't last forever. That's you healing. That's part of the process. It's a good thing. But most people don't know that. So they give up. And it's too hard to stand up because it was excruciating to stand up 3-4 months ago. And this has been 2 years ago since the initial, crisis. 3-4 months ago, it hurt so bad for me to stand up every morning. I was like, what is this? I've been in therapy for 5 sessions of therapy, and I can't stand up all of a sudden. And I couldn't give up. I just kept pushing. I said, God, help me. And I would limp to the restroom. I'd limp, whatever. And then the pain went away as quickly as it came. And then I got up one morning and I was like, I felt something weird under the foot that had the pain. And I was like, that's coldness. That means my sensation is coming back. That's what all the pain was. You know what I mean? And so the sensation hadn't come back on the right side below the knee. It had come above the knee and it had come pretty much 80-90% in the left leg, but it hadn't come back in the lower leg. I couldn't really feel, I can feel impact, but I couldn't feel hot, cold pain. And I started feeling hot, cold, and pain. So I was like, that's why. And I went to my one of my physical therapists, and I said, I'm in so much pain. They're like, you couldn't feel pain last month, could you? I said, no. And so now I realized I started rejoicing in my pain, And so one of the themes from when I spoke last, your pain is not in vain. And that doesn't just apply to recovering from paralysis and other things like that. Whatever you're going through in life, there's some pain in growing. There's some pain in expanding. There's some pain in going to places you've never been before. But it's not in vain. Somebody needs to know to hold on and not give up. Whatever you're going through is not for you. It's for the person you're going to bless. It's for the person that you're going to inspire. It's for the person you're going to tell it's going to be all right after a while. And so when I do my new show on IG Live called And Then Suddenly, I said the other night when I did the premiere show with Ryan Davis as my guest, this isn't about me recovering from total paralysis and spine surgery and all the medical emergencies. This is about me being able to say with authority, if God can bless me through all of that, he can find you a job. He can save your marriage. He can heal your body. If he can do what he did in my body, all of that at the same time, and I can still smile and say, God is still God. He can fix whatever's going on in your life. Whatever the doctor said is impossible, God specializes in the impossible. And so the only reason I went through everything I went through is so I can say with authority, God is still God.
Amen.
Amen.
All right. So listen, this was part one. So you want to
Part
listen
one.
next week for part
Part
two.
one.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, we're gonna let everybody get themselves together. But so let me get my final thought. But please tune in next week for part 2, because we want to get into more of what's next, more about your new podcast and what's to come. All right. So my final thought for today is rise above the storm to discover the sunshine of wisdom it brings. All right.
All right.
This is Women's Talk Live Overnights with your girl, April J.
I'm your girl, SassyScribe.
And this is KO Boogie.
And our special guest,
Miss
Charmel
Charmel.
McMillan.
All right, y'all. We'll see y'all next week.
Women talk live.